I ride my bicycle to work every day, as a lot of people in New York do. I was coming down off the Manhattan Bridge in the bike lane, approached a red traffic light. And, I know there are a ton of cyclists, in New York City that, just are running these things like, wild, and it can be dangerous. I'm not one of those people. I slowed down to about 5 miles per hour, ensure that there was nobody, crossing this pedestrian crosswalk. Saw 2 cops to the right, just rolled through. I was like, there's nothing going on here. I'm not just going to stop in the middle of the road in the bike lane. So I roll through slowly, and they flag me down. So I'm like, okay, cool. I'm on my way to work. I'm not trying to be arrested. So I, of course, moved to a stop. And this officer runs at me, grabs me by the arm, throws me to the ground off my bike.
What?
And I'm like, I ride a fixed gear bike, which if people don't know what that is, it's the pedals constantly move, and I have my feet strapped into the pedals as well. So like, there's no way for me to brace my fall when, this occurs as well. So, I just hit the ground hard, and I'm like kind of shaken up, and I get up and we go through the process of, why did you do that? I was stopping, of course he protested saying I wasn't stopping, which is absurd. I was just, coming to a slow, safe stop. And there was pedestrian witnesses there being like, you just assaulted this kid, what's going on? And if he's of course like, oh, this is not assault, blah, blah, blah. Issues me a $200 ticket, the whole thing. And I go about my day because I said, I'm on my way to work. Any time you engage an officer, it's, a calculated risk of like, to me at least, what can you say? How far can you push this kind of like public discourse in front of like pedestrians before they like find a reason to take you in? You know what
right.
I mean? So I just went about my day, but I mean, it's left me with 2 questions, which is, I guess just the nature of that, what we think that is it excessive force? Is it assault? And then my second question is like, how do we establish what the law is in these kind of gray areas? Because, I think we all understand that the bicycling infrastructure, is not what it should be. The pedestrians and cyclists have to constantly negotiate with each other, in terms of what's happening. People are, constantly jaywalking, which is also, technically against the law. And we do establish the law through this dry articulation of an antiquated penal code that's often not up to date with like the movement of people in the world? Or is it through like a shared precedent and a shared understanding of like how we take care of each other? Because the latter is kind of how I move through these kind of gray areas. Yeah. Because, I think just as easily, stopping at a traffic light in a bike lane where people don't expect you to be stopped could be potentially equally as dangerous as moving through it, or it's sometimes more so with the speed at which, people are riding bicycles in the bike lane.
Well, the issue too is that, one, I'm sorry that you were assaulted by the cop. That's what that was. You were assaulted and then charged for it. And like, I don't know if you have any recourse or if you even want to pursue it. And I'm sure it's probably more trouble than it's worth, is what you're saying. It's traumatizing in many ways. And, I'm sorry. But the part of this issue is, something Matt has talked a lot about too. And I'm becoming more aware of it as we work together more, just like watching how our city has been constructed for repurposed for the car to such an extent that like it is just treacherous for bike riders in the city, specifically when you think about it in the context of like what you're saying about how many New Yorkers, particularly in Brooklyn, ride to work. And then there's this whole new classification of gig workers, food delivery drivers. I don't know if it was either in New York Magazine or Curbed, that whole profile on delivery workers from a few months ago. I forget what it was, but how treacherous it is for delivery drivers coming on bikes in the city because there's just no infrastructure for it. So I kind of lost your question in my response there, but I mean, I want police reform. if that answers anything of what you were trying to ask.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like I just been thinking about it in so many different ways, and I'm, you know, I just can't imagine. I'm just like, I'm thinking what's going through that, you know, the cop's mind. Like, if I can be a little emotional for a second, like, I mean, we know a lot of these guys are just like roided up fucking maniacs from fucking Long Island that are, you know,
don't forget Staten Island.
They liken themselves to, you know, some deputized like superhero, and in his mind he's like, I'm not letting this guy get away, I'm gonna run at him and tackle him off the bicycle. And I'm just like, what was like, is like, how could that possibly be the response to an event as innocuous as running the traffic light? And that's what's on my mind. But I guess secondarily, my real question is, I'm like, how do we feel about these gray area things that technically I'm looking at my ticket and it's like, okay, cool. NYC bicycle red light, $190. Description of the offense: bicycle or skateboard failed to stop at red light, NYC. And I'm just like, does anybody honestly think we live in a universe where that's enforceable? And like the arbitrary nature of this kind of like punitive punishment, like what is that for? And then of course it gets
cops.
Our current mayor.
It's for cops to do what they want to do and then have the broadness to get away with it. That's what it is.
I mean, I think, you know, there's that to both points. Also, cops have quotas for giving out tickets. So obviously they're always on the lookout for ways to give out tickets and, you know, extract wealth from community. But anything your point is well taken too, that there a lot of cops that police New York City live in Long Island and view themselves as like, you know, an occupying military force for like a city that is full of like criminals and criminal elements that they have to like put down, you know, with various degrees of force. So I'm sure in his mind, he thought he was chasing down some dangerous criminals, because we know that generally cops don't solve crimes. They don't solve crimes. They don't stop crimes. All they do is like give out tickets and harass like various subpopulations of our society that we have criminalized. To your second point, I mean, look, as somebody who almost gets hit by bikes on various occasions while walking through the city, because like you said before, a lot of our like cyclists in the city, despite riding on bicycles, have sort of the same mentality surrounding sharing the, you know, sharing our, I guess, public space, whether it be roads or sidewalks, as people in cars do, which is that they're an individual out there trying to navigate the flow of traffic in a semi or like, you know, explicitly antagonistic way. You know, I doubt that you were actively trying to hit anybody, but, you know, I think that to the larger point, I agree with you. I think that we as a society fail to recognize that there is this kind of, you know, three-tiered level of how society's ethics work, for lack of a better term. I mean, I think sociology of law splits it up, you know, relatively, or rather to be a little bit reductive about that. It's like everyone has their own moral code, obviously. Everyone has a moral code that like they say that makes them think what is right versus what is wrong, you know, what is a gray area. And then we have like the law as it is written, which is theoretically supposed to be an agreed upon like moral code that we can like more or less like all agree to, even if it's not explicitly one-to-one with our own personal moral code. And then we have like that sort of third tier of like how the law is actually used by agents of the law in this country. And I think a lot of people do tend to focus on the very dry, very like, you know, on the books, here's what the law says, here's what the Constitution says, you know, as a way to having to either avoid, you know, be, you know, like you were saying, having a dynamic view to society, having to avoid having to deal with the problems that society has developed since the Constitution was written. And also, you know, on the other end, to justify the abuses by, rather the widespread and systematic abuses by law enforcement as somehow being different from, you know, our legal system. Because, well, yeah, our laws aren't explicitly racist. We just have a lot of racist cops who interpret them and enforce them racistly. We have a lot of judges who are on the payrolls of private prisons who, like, you know, sentence people with racist bias. But theoretically, we don't have any like laws that say it's okay to harass Black people explicitly. So I think that, your point is well taken, that we do have to have a better conversation about like what we expect and what the law means, and not just get caught up in like having the conversation like, well, yeah, technically you ran the light, so anything that happened to you afterwards was justified. Or if the police went too far, it's not an indication of a flaw or like a deep systematic flaw, because technically they weren't acting in like one-to-one lockstep with the law as it was written. I think a lot of people don't really realize how different the use of the law is from like what their own moral belief in what is right and wrong is, until they are, like 2 summers ago now, or maybe 1 summer ago, when like we saw a lot of Black Lives Matters, anti-police protests being like documented and shown on the news for the first time. And we just saw, a large portion of the population being exposed to the first time to just like cops cracking the heads of old people, and then being able to visually see like, oh no, this is the way the law is being used. The cops are saying that this old person who is protesting is violating some like, law on the books. And that would give them the right to use the law to crack their head open on the sidewalk. But from my own personal vantage point, I can see that that's wrong. And so, more and more people are being forced to, or rather more and more people who are coming in contact with the police are seeing this like obvious schism between not only just the law as it was written, but like their own personal moral code and like the way the law is being exercised by our, implicitly racist system and also explicitly racist system. Sorry to go in there for a little bit. I think I might have lost track.
Colin, we do have to, I think, jump. I'm sorry, but that was really well said, Brandon. Colin, do you have any final thoughts? I'm sorry again that this happened to you.
What did they ticket you for? Like, what did it say on the ticket? What did they say you were doing?
It was for not braking on a skateboard or bicycle, right?
Yeah, at a red light.
All right.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I would just say to as my final thing would just to remind people that when we're considering, the budget for the NYPD, that we have all this propaganda happening right now about violence, and I know people are experiencing real violence, and it becomes very easy to be susceptible to these narratives of why we need to fund the police. But I mean, functionally, in my experience in my city and our city, you all are here as well, is that it does not get used that way, and it instead gets used in these incredibly absurd, superficial ways to perform law and order punitively against citizens. And that's, I would just urge people to feel the reality of that, because that's what I felt. I stopped when they signaled me to stop, and people always say that if you just comply, you'd be fine. And transparently, like, I'm white, so I only have to experience things every, once in a few years. But it's the same logic of like, listen, I complied, I stopped, and I still got tackled and ripped to the ground by a police officer. Other people that don't look like me are going through much worse.
100%. But anyway, I hope you feel better, Colin. I'm sorry that happened.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Yeah. Have a great one.
You too. Jules Winfield says, after being assaulted by a cop like that, it's very important to report officer and even file a lawsuit. Filing a lawsuit is difficult. So not so you can get revenge or get paid, but so to get that terrible cop off the job. Why? Because if he'd assault a guy who obviously has resources commuting to work, imagine what he'd do to a 17-year-old kid who lives in a crappy neighborhood with zero resources. That cop is dangerous, and while it's unlikely that your case will cost him his job, it may. And if not, it adds to his record, giving the city more justification to fire him. I hear what you're saying. It's just, these things are cumbersome, and I hate it being on the individual to have to root out these bad cops, because it's not bad apples. It's the system. City politics is dominated by motorists and homeowners, not just in New York, but in every city. The knocks on Long Island and Staten Island ring pretty hollow, and Staten Island hasn't decided a mayoral election since Giuliani's first term, and Long Islanders can't vote at all. Take responsibility for your own pro-cop boroughs, please. And Brandon is right about bikes, but legally obscured license plates and BS enforcement are two sides of the same coin. Yeah, I mean, I'm not blaming Staten Island or Long Island.
But that's where the cops come
from. That's where they live.
Yeah, like that's an important point to make. Like, this is a very, this is endemic to policing in America. You look at Minneapolis, I think is one of the worst. Right. Where like every cop is from a lily white suburb.
Something like over 90% are outside of the city.
Exactly.
Yes.
And I fault Staten Island less, obviously, just because Staten Island is like within the 5 boroughs. So like I'm okay with like cops being from within the city limits. But like a lot of cops live in Nassau County, Suffolk County. They don't live in the city that they police. Like their actions do not have ramifications for anyone but the people that they like put their power on, as opposed to when they can just go home to their house in like fucking Levittown or something.
Yeah. Yep.
There's an article in a Momentum magazine. Berlin looks to create the largest car-free urban area on the planet. The subhead: people are being driven crazy by cars, says Thomas Howie. Obviously, this is much separate to the policing conversation, but
yes, but still.
But they bring so many problems to our streets, from benignly sitting there 95% of the day, occupying space at a massively reduced price compared to the land value, to causing deaths of innocent pedestrians and cyclists. Yeah.